The scent of lemon polish and old money always clung to the air in Rosewood Estates, a sort of invisible veil that separated the world inside from everything else. For Julia Ramirez, it was just another Tuesday, but then again, every day felt like just another day since she'd started as the new housekeeper at the Sterling mansion. She was there to clean, to organize, to maintain the perfect facade of wealth that the Sterling family meticulously curated. No more, no less. That's what David Sterling, the young, sharp-edged CEO of Sterling Tech, had made crystal clear on her first day. He barely met her eyes, dismissed her with a wave of his hand, and left his mother, Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, a woman sculpted from pearls and icy disapproval, to lay down the household rules. But rules, Julia thought, were always a little different when children were involved. It was just past noon, and the mid-morning sun, usually a cheerful splash of light, felt oddly muted through the grand bay windows of the Sterling study. Julia was meticulously wiping down the mahogany desk, her movements quiet, almost invisible. She'd always prided herself on that, on being unobtrusive, efficient. It was a skill honed over years, a survival tactic in a world that often tried to make people like her feel too loud, too visible, too much. But then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whimper from the adjoining library. Amelia. The Sterling's granddaughter, a little girl of 7, had been a ghost in this house since her mother, David's wife, passed away last year. She moved through the grand halls like a whispered secret, her laughter a forgotten melody. Julia had seen the way Amelia clung to the shadows, the way her small shoulders would hunch at the slightest unexpected sound. No one else seemed to notice, not really. Not the busy David, lost in his corporate empire, nor Eleanor, who seemed to view childhood as a phase to be tolerated rather than nurtured. Even Agnes, the long-serving head housekeeper, a woman whose stern gaze could curdle milk, only saw Amelia as another responsibility on her daily checklist. But Julia saw a child aching for warmth, for a safe harbor in a storm she couldn't understand. Just yesterday, Amelia had stumbled, scraping her knee on the flagstone path in the garden. Agnes had clucked about clumsy children and stained dresses. David sighed about fragile sensibilities. But Julia, without thinking, had simply knelt, offered a gentle hand, and wiped away a tear that had nothing to do with the scrape. The child had looked at her with wide, trusting eyes, a flicker of something long absent. It was a small moment, fleeting, but it had stayed with Julia, a tiny seed of connection in a field of indifference. So now, hearing that quiet whimper, Julia didn't hesitate. She placed the polishing cloth down, her heart giving a soft, unfamiliar squeeze. She found Amelia curled up on a plush armchair, a thick, unopened picture book in her lap. Her cheeks were flushed, a faint tremor ran through her small frame, and a silent tear traced a path down her pale face. Amelia, sweetheart. Julia's voice was a soft hum, a stark contrast to the clipped tones that usually echoed in these halls. The girl startled, her eyes, usually downcast, flickered up, wide and full of a desperate vulnerability. I can't sleep, Amelia whispered, her voice barely a breath. And I miss Mama. Julia's heart twisted. She knew that ache, that profound, bone-deep longing for someone lost. It was a familiar ghost in her own life, a shadow she'd carried for years. She sat on the floor beside the armchair, her presence calming, grounding. Sometimes, Julia began, her voice low and comforting, when my own heart aches, I find that a quiet story helps, or sometimes just a warm hand. She gently, almost tentatively, reached out and placed her palm on Amelia's forehead. It was warm, too warm, the kind of warm that made a mama bear instinct rise in Julia's chest. Just as Amelia leaned into the touch, a deep, sharp voice sliced through the quiet, cutting through the air like a razor. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Julia's hand froze midair, a jolt running through her. Her breath hitched. David, he was home. He wasn't supposed to be home. Her mind raced, a sudden cold panic seizing her. She had only meant to soothe the child, to check on her fever. The nanny had called in sick, and David had a late board meeting. No one else was around. She couldn't just leave Amelia. David Sterling stood framed in the doorway, a thundercloud in a custom-tailored suit. His eyes, usually cool and calculating, blazed with an icy fury. His jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to crack. His fists, she noticed, were white-knuckled at his sides. "I asked you a question, Miss Ramirez." His voice, usually a smooth baritone, was raw with barely controlled rage. "Why is your hand on my daughter's forehead? What the hell do you think you are to touch her?" Amelia whimpered, her tiny body tensing, pressing herself against Julia's side. Julia pulled her hand back slowly, deliberately, her own heart thundering against her ribs. She stood, her posture straight, her gaze steady, though a tremor ran through her. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice soft but unwavering, "Amelia has a fever. She was crying. I was only trying to—" "You were only trying to overstep," David roared, cutting her off. He strode into the room, his movements sharp, predatory. "You were hired to clean, Miss Ramirez, to ensure this house maintains its pristine condition. You are not her caregiver. You are certainly not her mother. You do not touch my child without my express permission." Amelia, startled by her father's booming voice, let out a soft, confused cry. She clung to Julia's dress, her small fingers clutching the fabric like a lifeline. David's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking from Amelia's clinging hand to Julia's calm face, as if trying to find some hidden malevolence there. "Take your hands off her," he commanded, his voice tight with disdain. Julia gently unwrapped Amelia's fingers from her dress, a silent promise in her touch that she wasn't abandoning her. She stepped back, a controlled dignity in her posture. Amelia let out a heartbroken sob, her small arms reaching not for her father, but for Julia. "Maya," she whimpered, the name a soft, unexpected plea that hung heavy in the air. David froze, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before anger hardened it again. He scooped Amelia up roughly, pulling her away from Julia with a jolt that made the little girl shriek in fear, burying her face into his shoulder. He glared at Julia, his eyes burning with suspicion. "Get your things," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "You're done here. I won't have some unknown entity injecting herself into my family's life." Julia looked at the frightened child, now sobbing uncontrollably into her father's shoulder, tears soaking the expensive fabric of his suit. She saw the familiar fear in Amelia's eyes, the same fear she'd once seen in her own younger brother's face so many years ago. She swallowed, a bitter taste rising in her throat. There was no point in arguing, no defense that would penetrate that wall of judgment and arrogance. She simply nodded once, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her chin, and turned to leave the room in silence. The heavy oak door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving only the echo of Amelia's fading cries and David's hard, furious breathing. Julia walked downstairs, her back straight, her heart aching, but a quiet fire, small but undeniable, had begun to stir within her. This wasn't just about a job. It was about dignity, about seeing a child in need, and about a silent battle she hadn't realized she was already fighting. She just hoped that fire wouldn't be extinguished by the sheer weight of judgment that seemed to permeate every corner of this grand, cold house. Julia packed her small duffel bag, the same worn canvas bag she'd carried from one temporary job to the next, from one quiet town to another. The sting of David Sterling's words still echoed in her ears, sharper than any slap. Unknown entity. It was funny, in a bitter sort of way, how quickly she could become a phantom in these grand, impersonal houses.
She folded her modest clothes with care, a habit born of necessity, of making do with little. She didn't speak to Agnes, who watched her from the hallway with a triumphant gleam in her eyes, nor to any of the other staff who pointedly avoided her gaze. There was no defense to offer, no explanation that would penetrate their ingrained prejudices. It was just another exit, another silent sacrifice in a life that seemed to demand them constantly. Leaving Amelia was the hardest part. The child's heartbroken cry, her small arms reaching out, that whispered Maya, a name Julia hadn't heard since her own childhood, a nickname only her late brother used to call her. It twisted something deep inside Julia. She wished she could explain, wished she could just hold the little girl one more time. But the cold logic of the situation, the rigid lines drawn by people like David Sterling, dictated otherwise. She walked out the service entrance, the heavy door closing behind her like a final punctuation mark, leaving only the ghost of baby shampoo and a child's lingering sadness in her wake. The brisk autumn air outside felt like a welcome shock, a harsh but honest reality after the stifling atmosphere of the Sterling mansion. For 2 days, Julia tried to put Rosewood Estates out of her mind. She picked up a few odd cleaning jobs, enough to cover her small apartment rent. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her new, quiet routine, the one she'd painstakingly built over the years to keep herself safe, to stay hiding. But every time she saw a child, every time a small, distant cry echoed in her memory, she thought of Amelia. She wondered if the little girl was still having nightmares, if anyone was reading her the silly rhyming books Julia had discovered were Amelia's favorites. She knew the answer was probably no.
Meanwhile, back at the Sterling mansion, the silence that followed Julia's departure wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Amelia's quiet whimpers escalated into nightly episodes of inconsolable crying, her small body racked with tremors even in sleep. David tried everything. He called in top pediatricians, child psychologists, even a renowned sleep specialist from Johns Hopkins. They offered diagnoses, prescriptions, and advice about boundaries and re-establishing parental authority. Nothing worked. Amelia simply curled into herself, her eyes haunted, whispering for Maya. One particularly brutal night, Amelia's fever spiked. Her skin was clammy, her breathing ragged, and she was inconsolable, pushing away the medicine, the water, even David's frantic attempts to comfort her. Panic, cold and raw, clawed at David. He paced the nursery, phone pressed to his ear, leaving desperate voicemails for the pediatrician, the on-call nurse, anyone who could tell him what to do. But no one was there. No one knew how to reach this small, terrified child. He felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. He'd built an empire, commanded boardrooms, but he was utterly, painfully useless in this moment. Amelia's tiny arms reached out, not for him, but vaguely towards the door, a desperate, raspy whisper escaping her lips. Maya! It was a shot in the dark, a last desperate gamble. David swallowed his pride, a bitter, unfamiliar taste, and called Frank, the old estate manager. Frank, a man of few words but keen observation, listened patiently to David's breathless, panicked description of Amelia's condition. "Sir," Frank said, his voice calm, steady as an oak, "Maya, she has a way with the little one. Always did." He gave David Julia's address, scrawled on a piece of paper. "It's a long shot, sir, but sometimes, when you're out of options, you go with what works." Driving through the cold, late-night streets of Boston, David felt a strange mixture of shame and desperate hope. His expensive car, usually a symbol of his power and control, felt hollow, useless. He found Julia's apartment building, an old brick walk-up on the south side, a world away from Rosewood Estates. He felt a fresh wave of judgment, quickly followed by a crushing sense of hypocrisy. He knocked, then pounded on the door. Nothing. He called out, his voice hoarse, desperate. "Julia, Miss Ramirez, it's David Sterling. Please, it's Amelia. She's sick again."
A window on the second floor creaked open. Julia's cautious voice drifted down, laced with an understandable suspicion. "Mr. Sterling." She hadn't expected to ever hear from him again, especially not like this. "It's Amelia," he gasped, breathless, the words tumbling out. "She's sick. I don't know what to do. Please." A long pause. David could almost feel her hesitation, the quiet calculation. Then the window closed. 2 agonizing minutes later, the main door opened. Julia stood there, in a simple hoodie and jeans, a tote bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes tired but steady. "Where is she?" she asked, no judgment in her voice, only a quiet, urgent concern. The drive back to Rosewood was silent, punctuated only by Amelia's soft, troubled whimpers from the back seat. Julia didn't ask questions, didn't gloat. She simply moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency when they arrived. She didn't wait for direction. She navigated the grand house like she'd lived there her whole life, straight to Amelia's nursery. "Hi, baby girl," she whispered, taking the feverish child from David's trembling arms. Amelia whimpered once, then melted against Julia's chest, her sobbing instantly slowing, her small body finally stilling. David stood there, stunned, watching. It was like magic, only it wasn't. It was simply presence.
Julia checked Amelia's temperature with the back of her hand, unzipped her footy pajamas slightly, felt behind her ears. She's warm, but not dangerously so, breathing shallow. "You tried medicine?" she asked, her voice calm, professional. David mumbled about Amelia refusing it. "She will now," Julia said, and she did. With a few soft hums and quiet words, Julia coaxed the dose into Amelia, drop by small drop. She used a damp cloth to wipe Amelia's forehead, gently ran her fingers through the child's curly hair, a touch so tender it made David's throat tighten. "I'll stay with her until she sleeps," Julia said, not looking up, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. David wanted to say something, apologize, explain, but the words were heavy, choked in his throat. So he just left the room, leaving Julia and Amelia in the soft glow of the crescent moon nightlight. Downstairs, in the quiet of the kitchen, pouring himself a drink, David began to understand. It wasn't just guilt now, it was the chilling realization of his own utter failure, his blind arrogance. He'd hired Julia to clean bathrooms, to be unseen, but she had seen his daughter, truly seen her, and given her a comfort he, her own father, couldn't provide. Frank had been right. Julia had done something he couldn't, and it was starting to gnaw at him, a quiet, insistent ache that demanded attention. He knew, with a certainty that both terrified and humbled him, that something had to change. This quiet strength, this woman he had so carelessly dismissed, was the very thing his family desperately needed. The air in the Sterling mansion had shifted, ever so subtly. Julia was back, not as the new housekeeper, but as Amelia's dedicated caregiver. David, still stiff with residual pride, acknowledged her presence, a grudging acceptance in his clipped tones. Old man Edward Sterling, however, had welcomed her with a quiet warmth that both surprised and unnerved Julia. He'd observed her with a thoughtful gaze, a silent understanding passing between them that felt both ancient and immediate. But even with Edward's unspoken approval, the shadows of judgment still lingered, most notably in Agnes's narrowed eyes and the hushed whispers of the other staff. Julia could feel their suspicion, a constant hum beneath the polished surfaces of the house. Agnes, especially, seemed to relish finding fault, reporting every perceived overstep to David, hinting at Julia's mysterious past, trying to sow seeds of doubt. Julia, as always, met their hostility with a quiet dignity, her focus, Amelia. One crisp afternoon, a plain, unmarked envelope appeared in David's morning mail. Inside, a single, grainy photograph, clearly old, showed Julia as a much younger woman, standing outside a run-down community center in a city far away. The reverse side had a crudely scrawled note. "She's not who you think she is. Check her past.
you'll lose everything." David's jaw tightened. He'd dismissed Agnes's insinuations, but this was different. Then came the emails from anonymous accounts hinting at a past steeped in trouble, mentions of street gangs, debt, even a subtle reference to witness protection. The carefully constructed facade of David's orderly world began to crack. He confronted Julia in the library, the very room where he'd first exploded at her. The afternoon sun once again streamed through the windows, but now it felt harsh, unforgiving. Amelia was upstairs, thankfully napping, spared from the tension that crackled between them. "Miss Ramirez," David began, his voice dangerously low, holding up the photograph. "What is this? What is this?" He slid a printed-out email across the polished desk, the subject line screaming, "Truth about your nanny." "I'm getting anonymous tips, emails, hints about involvement with unsavory characters, drugs, debt, a subtle reference to witness protection." The carefully constructed facade of David's orderly world began to crack.
Julia looked at the photo, then at the email. Her face, usually so composed, paled slightly, but her eyes, those deep, steady pools, met his without a flicker of fear. A quiet resignation settled over her features. "It's my past, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice soft but clear, a tremor running just beneath the surface. "A past I thought I'd left behind." She didn't elaborate, didn't defend, just that simple, stark admission. David slammed his hand on the desk, the sudden noise echoing through the quiet room. "Left behind? You think you can just leave behind a past like that and waltz into my home, into my daughter's life? You think I can trust you with Amelia, knowing you've been involved in that kind of world? Are you crazy, or am I?" He was practically shouting now, the rage and fear that had been simmering for weeks finally boiling over. "You lied to me! You manipulated your way in here!" "I didn't lie," Julia replied, her voice still quiet, but with an unexpected steel. "I simply didn't offer information that wasn't asked, and I came here to work, to build a new life, to be safe. I never manipulated anything, Mr. Sterling. I just cared." Just as David was about to unleash another furious retort, the heavy oak door creaked open. Edward Sterling stood on the threshold, his usually serene face etched with a rare urgency. He held a tablet in his hand, its screen glowing with what looked like a news article. Both David and Julia turned to him, stunned. Edward's gaze swept over the tense scene, lingering on Julia's pale face, then on the photograph and the email on the desk. He sighed, a deep, weary sound. "David," he said, his voice quiet but resonating with an undeniable authority that instantly silenced his son. "Perhaps," he said, "you should hear the full story before you pass judgment." David stared at his father, confused, his anger momentarily forgotten. "Father, what are you talking about? She just admitted." "I know what she admitted," Edward interjected, his eyes fixing on Julia with an expression of profound respect. "Because I already knew." David froze, his face draining of color. Agnes, who had been lingering just outside the open door, gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. She backed away slowly, as if struck by an invisible blow. Edward stepped into the room, walking with a deliberate slowness that commanded attention. He stood beside Julia, a silent, powerful ally. "Miss Ramirez," he said, his voice softening as he addressed her directly, "I believe it's time you told your story, not just to David, but to anyone who has dared to question your integrity." He turned to his son, his gaze piercing. "David, do you know how Miss Ramirez came to work for us?" David shook his head, still reeling. "Father, what are you talking about? She just admitted." "I know what she admitted," Edward interjected, his eyes fixing on Julia with an expression of profound respect. "Because I already knew." David froze, his face draining of color. Agnes, who had been lingering just outside the open door, drawn by the raised voices, gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. She backed away slowly, as if struck by an invisible blow.
Edward stepped into the room, walking with a deliberate slowness that commanded attention. He stood beside Julia, a silent, powerful ally. "Miss Ramirez," he said, his voice softening as he addressed her directly, "I believe it's time you told your story, not just to David, but to anyone who has dared to question your integrity." He turned to his son, his gaze piercing. "David, do you know how Miss Ramirez came to work for us?" David shook his head, still reeling. "Father, what are you talking about?" "Indeed," Edward said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "But it wasn't a simple hiring. Years ago, I established a discreet philanthropic initiative supporting individuals who, through no fault of their own, were trying to escape dangerous pasts. People who had shown immense courage, immense resilience, but found themselves cornered by circumstances. Julia, Miss Ramirez, she was one of them." Julia finally looked at Edward, a spark of vulnerability, then profound gratitude lighting up her eyes.
"You see, David," Edward continued, his voice now imbued with a quiet pride, "Julia isn't involved with a criminal element, she's a survivor. 10 years ago, her younger brother, a bright, gentle boy she practically raised, became entangled with a violent loan shark ring in their old neighborhood, a man named Leo Morales. When he disappeared, Julia, barely out of her teens, bravely stepped forward. She put her life on the line. She became an anonymous witness against Morales, providing crucial testimony that ultimately helped law enforcement bring down his operation. She saved countless other young people from falling into his trap. But it cost her everything. Her name, her home, her dreams of finishing nursing school to become a pediatric nurse. Morales vowed he'd find her. She's been running, quietly rebuilding her life ever since." David stood there, utterly speechless, his mouth slightly agape. The initial anger had vanished, replaced by a profound, gut-wrenching shame. He looked at Julia, really looked at her, and saw not a shady past, but an incredible, unfathomable strength. A woman who had faced true evil, not as a victim, but as a silent warrior. "This woman," Edward declared, his voice rising, resonating through the room, "this woman you so casually dismissed as an unknown entity, as just a cleaner, she possessed more courage in her little finger than most people gather in a lifetime. She didn't manipulate her way into our lives. She was placed here by me, with full knowledge, because I saw a spirit that could bring warmth back into this cold house, a compassion that could reach our Amelia in ways none of us could." He paused, his gaze sweeping over his son, then towards the now empty doorway where Agnes had stood. "And anyone in this household who cannot see that, who cannot recognize the true value of a human being, regardless of their past or their position, is welcome to leave today. Their services are no longer required." A heavy silence descended. David, still reeling, could only nod, his eyes fixed on Julia, a mixture of awe, regret, and a dawning respect washing over his face. He remembered Amelia's whispered Maya and the way his daughter had clung to this woman who was, in every sense that mattered, a hero. He, the great CEO, had been so utterly, painfully wrong. The shock was palpable, a silent earthquake shaking the very foundations of the Sterling household's ingrained prejudices. And for Julia, a quiet, almost imperceptible sense of vindication settled in her heart. The weight of judgment, for a brief, glorious moment, felt lighter. The truth, after years of hiding, had finally been unveiled. The silence that followed Edward Sterling's revelation in the library was thicker than any fog rolling in from the coast. David Sterling stood frozen, the harsh fluorescent light of the grand chandelier suddenly seeming too bright, too revealing. His face, usually a mask of corporate composure, was a landscape of shock and dawning horror. Agnes, the head housekeeper, had vanished, scurrying away like a cockroach exposed to light, her earlier triumph dissolving into panicked retreat.
The other staff, those who had whispered and scoffed, now avoided Julia's gaze, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and a grudging, reluctant respect. David tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at Julia, then at his father. The shame was a bitter bile in his mouth. He, the brilliant CEO, the master of precision and control, had been so utterly, painfully wrong. He judged a woman, a hero, based on flimsy gossip and his own ingrained prejudices. And worse, he had nearly cost Amelia the one person who had truly reached her since Maria's death. Just as the weight of his realization threatened to crush him, Amelia, woken by the earlier commotion, padded into the library, her small face tear-streaked. She looked at her father, then, with unerring instinct, she moved past him and clung to Julia's leg. "Maya," she whimpered, her voice tiny and trembling.
Julia immediately knelt, wrapping Amelia in a gentle hug. "Hey, sweet pea," she murmured, her voice a soothing balm. "It's okay, I'm right here." David watched as his daughter, who had resisted his every attempt at comfort just moments ago, melted into Julia's embrace, her sobs subsiding into soft sniffles. It was a stark, undeniable testament to Julia's invaluable presence. He looked away, the raw truth of his failure too much to bear. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in Rosewood Estates was awkward, to say the least. Agnes, caught in the crossfire of Edward's quiet fury and David's dawning understanding, offered a mungled, insincere apology to Julia before tendering her resignation, effective immediately. Other staff members, those who had sided with Agnes, either followed suit or became conspicuously helpful, their former disdain replaced by an almost frantic politeness. The air was cleared, but the healing was just beginning. David, for his part, was a man humbled. He stopped avoiding Julia, though their interactions were still stiff, formal. He started to watch her, to truly observe the quiet grace with which she moved through the house, the infinite patience she showed Amelia, the way she could transform a tantrum into a quiet laugh. One afternoon, he found them in the sun-drenched conservatory, Julia teaching Amelia how to gently prune a small rosebush, her hands demonstrating the delicate art of nurturing growth. "You know," David said, his voice hesitant, "the board is impressed with your resilience." Julia looked up, a faint, almost sardonic smile on her lips. "Resilience, Mr. Sterling," she replied, "is what you learn when you've got no other choice." He found himself seeking her out, not for Amelia's needs, but for his own unspoken questions. He'd ask about Amelia's moods, her quiet moments, and Julia would answer with a depth of understanding that surprised him. Slowly, tentatively, he began to ask about her own past, not with suspicion, but with genuine curiosity. Julia, in turn, began to open up, sharing fragments of her life, of her brother, of the choices she'd had to make. She spoke of the struggle, the fear, the constant looking over her shoulder. "You know," she said one evening, over mugs of chamomile tea in the quiet kitchen, "I always thought running was weakness. But sometimes, Mr. Sterling, running is the only way to survive. And sometimes, staying when you've found a reason to, that's the bravest thing of all." David leaned back, taking in her words. "My father," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion, "he always said legacy was about what you built. Towers, companies, fortunes. But I'm starting to think he also meant something else. Something about the people you uplift." Julia simply nodded, her gaze steady, understanding. It wasn't about a sudden, dramatic apology. It was about the slow, painful process of unlearning a lifetime of privilege and prejudice. One day, Edward called a family meeting. Just the three of them, Edward, David, and Julia, in the elegant drawing room. "Julia," Edward began, his eyes twinkling with a quiet satisfaction, "I've been watching you. You've brought a light into this house that we haven't seen in years. And you, David," he turned to his son, "you finally learned to see.
He then presented Julia with a new contract, not as a housekeeper, but as a family care director, a role with significantly higher pay, benefits, and, most importantly, the explicit authority to manage Amelia's well-being and schedule. This, Edward said, is merely a formality for what you already do. But it also means you're no longer a secret, Julia. You are part of the family.
David, for the first time, looked directly at Julia, his eyes holding a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Julia," he said, his voice low, I was wrong. About everything. I'm truly sorry." He extended his hand, not as a boss to an employee, but as one human being reaching out to another. Julia hesitated for a fraction of a second, then grasped his hand. It was a firm, honest handshake, a silent acknowledgement of a new beginning. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a quiet victory in a battle she hadn't even known she was fighting until it was almost over. The weight of her past, the burden of being the unknown entity, began to lift, replaced by the warmth of acceptance and the promise of a future where her quiet strength could finally bloom. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a home, a chance to rebuild, and a powerful lesson in what truly defines family. Life at Rosewood Estates had settled into a rhythm, one far warmer and more harmonious than before. The grand house, once echoing with the cold silence of grief and the sharp edges of unspoken judgment, now resonated with the soft hum of Amelia's laughter, the gentle rustle of Julia reading bedtime stories, and the quiet, steady conversations between David and Julia. Amelia thrived, her eyes bright, her energy boundless, a testament to the quiet flame Julia had rekindled within her. David, once so consumed by his corporate world, now spent more time at home, truly present, truly engaged, learning the delicate art of fatherhood from the woman he had once so callously dismissed. One crisp autumn evening, as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold over the manicured gardens, David found Julia sitting on the swing bench beneath the weeping willow, the same spot where she had once considered walking away for good. Amelia was asleep upstairs, her bunny clutched tight. David sat beside her, handing her a steaming mug of her favorite herbal tea. "The board meeting today," he began, his voice soft. "It was different." Julia looked at him, a question in her eyes. "I told them," he continued, "that the future of Sterling Tech isn't just about profit margins and market shares. It's about compassion. It's about integrity. It's about believing in people, not just their resumes. I told them that our company, bearing the Sterling name, must reflect our values, and that Julia Ramirez, the woman who brought light back into this house, is not just a part of my family, but a part of our legacy." Julia blinked, a profound emotion swelling in her chest. She hadn't expected such a public declaration, such an unwavering stance. "And they," she asked, her voice barely a whisper. David smiled, a genuine, open smile that reached his eyes, a smile she rarely saw in the early days. Some balked, of course, the old guard, but enough of them listened, enough of them saw, and I also told them, he paused, his gaze meeting hers, that I'll be stepping back from day-to-day operations, more time for Amelia, more time for us, and more time to build something new, something that truly embodies what we've learned here. Weeks turned into months, and what began as a quiet conversation under a willow tree blossomed into a tangible dream. Inspired by Julia's journey, and with Edward's full support and David's considerable resources, they established the Rosewood Compassion Foundation. Its mission was clear and powerful: to provide safe havens, mentorship, and educational opportunities for women and children escaping difficult pasts, offering them not just a new start, but the tools to thrive and rebuild their lives with dignity.
Julia, once a woman who hid from the spotlight, became the quiet, steadfast face of the foundation, her personal story of resilience and courage becoming a beacon of hope for countless others. She shared her experiences, not with self-pity, but with a quiet strength that resonated deeply.
One memorable afternoon, the foundation hosted its first major community event, a Bloom and Grow Fair, right on the sprawling lawns of Rosewood Estates. The air, once heavy with the scent of old money, was now filled with the joyful sounds of children laughing, the aroma of homemade baked goods, and the murmurs of hopeful conversations. Amelia, no longer the timid shadow, twirled in a sun-yellow dress, her laughter bright and uninhibited, pulling David and Julia towards a face-painting booth. As Julia watched Amelia get a butterfly painted on her cheek, she felt David take her hand. "You know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I used to think my father's legacy was just about the empire he built, but you've shown me it's about something far more precious. It's about compassion, forgiveness, and finding strength in vulnerability. You taught me what it means to truly lead, not just in a boardroom, but in life." Julia squeezed his hand. "And you," she replied, her eyes glistening, "you taught me that sometimes the safest place to be is not in hiding, but in the light, surrounded by people who truly see you." Later that evening, after the last guest had left and Amelia was tucked soundly in bed, Julia and David sat by the roaring fireplace in the library, a sense of profound peace enveloping them. David pulled out a small velvet box. "Julia," he said, his voice a little shaky, "I know this isn't how things usually happen, but our story, it's ours, and I can't imagine a future or a legacy without you." He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring, not flashy, but deeply meaningful. "Will you build this new life, this new chapter with me? Not just as Amelia's caregiver, not just as the force behind the foundation, but as my partner, my wife?" Tears welled in Julia's eyes, soft, joyful tears she hadn't allowed herself in years. The quiet fire within her, once a spark of survival, now blazed with the warmth of love and belonging. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, David, 1,000 times yes." The following spring, under a canopy of blooming cherry blossoms in the Rosewood Gardens, Julia and David exchanged vows in a small, intimate ceremony. Amelia, a radiant little flower girl, watched with wide, happy eyes. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, not in the traditional sense. It was something far more real, far more profound. It was a testament to the power of human connection, the courage to confront prejudice, and the transformative grace of a second chance. The message for all who witnessed their journey and for generations to come was clear. True value isn't measured by wealth or status, but by the strength of your spirit, the depth of your compassion, and the light you bring into the world. And in the heart of Rosewood, a quiet flame had indeed found its eternal home. Life, as they say, often throws us curveballs when we least expect them. But sometimes those unexpected turns, those painful moments of judgment and injustice, are precisely what lead us to discover the truest meaning of courage and compassion. The story of Julia and the Sterling family, much like so many lives around us, reminds us that the human spirit is an astonishingly resilient thing. It teaches us that true worth isn't found in a job title, a bank account, or the color of one's skin. It's etched in the quiet strength of those who face adversity head-on, in the empathy that reaches across divides, and in the unwavering belief that every single person holds immeasurable value, regardless of where they come from or what their past holds. We live in a world where snap judgments and harmful stereotypes can still build walls between us. But as we've seen, it only takes one person, one brave voice to begin to dismantle those barriers. It's a powerful lesson, isn't it? To look beyond the surface, to question our own biases, and to truly see the individual standing before us, with all their complexities and their untold stories. Just like Julia, we all have a quiet flame within us, a resilience, a capacity for love and strength that can light up even the darkest corners.
And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is to simply choose to let that flame burn brightly, refusing to be dimmed by the whispers of doubt or the weight of judgment. Because when we do, we not only liberate ourselves, but we inspire others to do the same, creating a ripple effect of understanding and hope that extends far beyond our immediate reach. What resonates most with you from Julia's journey? Have you ever felt the sting of unfair judgment, or perhaps found unexpected strength in a challenging situation? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Your experiences might be just the light someone else needs. If this story touched your heart, give it a thumbs up to show your support, and make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more powerful narratives that aim to inspire and provoke thought. May your own quiet flame guide your path, bringing peace and hope amidst life's beautiful, unpredictable journey.